She was already dead before she hit the forest floor, not the body. The body kept moving, kept breathing, kept putting one foot in front of the other through the snow and the dark and the howling nothing of the Valdenmoor borderlands. The body is a stubborn thing. It does not ask permission to survive. But the woman who had walked into the great hall of Valdenmoor that night in a gown the color of bone, the woman who had pressed her hand against her own heart to feel the mate bond humming warm and certain beneath her ribs, the woman who had believed, with everything she was, that fate does not build something just to burn it down. She was gone. She died the moment Zayden Voss turned his eyes away from her in front of 400 wolves and said the words. She died in the silence that followed. When she died watching him reach for the hand of another woman without a single tremor in his fingers. And the body kept walking, into the dark, into the cold, into the Greywood forest, where no Valdenmoor wolf followed, because nothing that went deep into the Greywood ever came back the same, and they all knew it. And not one of them came after her. Not one. Remember that. Hold it. Because everything that happens next begins right there. In that fact, in that silence, in the moment 400 wolves watched a woman walk into the dark alone and turn back to their wine. He did not just reject her. He looked at her, felt the bond, felt the moon goddess herself pulling the thread between them taut, felt all of it, every single thing that she was feeling, because that is what bonds do. They do not allow ignorance. They do not allow pretending. They force you to feel the other person's heartbeat as clearly as your own. He felt her, and he chose anyway. That is not a man who did not know what he was doing. That is a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and that is so much worse. Because Rhavyn had spent 6 weeks before that night feeling him at the edges of herself, 6 weeks of knowing without being told which direction he was in, 6 weeks of waking in the dark and feeling his heartbeat like a second pulse inside her own chest, 6 weeks of believing, with the particular devastating certainty of someone receiving a gift they never asked for, but recognize immediately as the truest thing that has ever been offered to them. 6 weeks of falling without knowing she was falling, toward a man who was already building the walls to catch her on. When she walked into that hall already his, in every way that the bond makes you someone's, and he stood there, and he felt all of it, and he opened his mouth, and he threw it away, in front of 400 people, without a tremor in his hands, without a single moment of hesitation. And do you know what the most unforgivable part was? Not the rejection. Women survive rejection. Women have been surviving the particular cruelty of men who feel something real and choose comfort instead, long before wolf kingdoms or mate bonds or blood moon ceremonies existed. The most unforgivable part was the silence afterward. 400 wolves, 400 members of his pack who felt the bond snap through the hall like a bowstring cut at full tension, who felt Rhavyn absorb the blow of it in real time, or who watched her stand there and take it with her hands at her sides and her spine straight and her face holding itself together through sheer force of a dignity she had not been given enough years to have earned yet. 400 wolves, and not one voice, not one person said, "This is wrong." Not one person stepped forward, not one person who looked at the girl in the bone-white gown and said, "I see what is happening to you, and I will not pretend that I do not." 400 witnesses, 400 silences. That was what broke her, not him, not his words, not even the sight of him reaching for another woman's hand while Rhavyn's chest was still splitting open from the inside. The silence of 400 people who saw and said nothing. She walked out of that hall carrying that silence inside her alongside everything else. She walked into the darkest forest in the Northern Territories. She walked into 6 years of cold and exile in the slow, devastating waking of something in her blood that the wolf kingdoms had spent 3 centuries hoping would never wake again. And she walked out the other side of all of it carrying a daughter with her mother's blood and her father's eyes and the patience of a forest that does not measure time the way kingdoms do. A daughter who was not going to be silent. Not for anyone. Not ever. Stay right where you are. You need to hear what she built in that darkness. You need to hear what the child carried into the world. And you need to hear what happened when they walked back out of that forest and stood at the edge of Valdemar and let themselves be seen. Because the silence that fell over that kingdom when they returned was a completely different kind of silence. The kind that comes right before everything changes. Rhavyn had known about the bond for 6 weeks before the blood moon ceremony. 6 weeks of feeling him at the edges of her awareness, like a second heartbeat she had not been born with. 6 weeks of knowing his direction the way you know north without a compass. Bone deep and wordless. 6 weeks of understanding that the moon goddess had made a decision about her life, and the decision was Zayden Voss, Alpha of Valdemar, the coldest and most feared ruler in the northern wolf territories. She had not been afraid. That was the thing she could never fully explain afterward in the long, dark years that followed. She had not been afraid of him, and she had felt the bond and understood it, and simply accepted it the way you accept weather, because the bond does not ask. It simply is. She had dressed carefully that night. The bone-white gown, her mother's ring on her right hand, the one carved from dark wood that her family line had passed down through 7 generations, the one that held the last trace of Greywood blood in a form she could carry on her body. Her dark hair was loose down her back because the old ways said a fated mate should come to the ceremony unbound. She had walked into the great hall of Valdemar Keep, and she had felt him across the room before she saw him, that second heartbeat spiking hard in her chest, and she had looked up and found his eyes already on her. And for 3 seconds that she would spend the rest of her life turning over in her hands like a stone with a sharp edge, he had looked at her with something unguarded in his face, something that was almost recognition, something that was almost the answering pull of the bond moving in him the way it moved in her. 3 seconds, and then it was gone, and the thing that replaced it was nothing. Not cruelty, not contempt, something worse than both of those things. Calculation. She saw the exact moment he made his decision. She saw it cross his face like a door closing, and she had just enough time to understand what was coming before he opened his mouth. He said he stood before the pack and before the moon goddess and before the bond that had presumed to choose for him. He said he refused it. He said the name of the woman he had already chosen, with the one standing 3 feet to his left, with the Valdemar Alliance Treaty effectively sewn into the lining of her dress, and he said she would be his Luna. And then he looked back at Rhavyn. And that was the worst part. Not the words. Look after the words. The look that said he had seen her, truly seen the bond and what it was and what it meant, and he had weighed it against everything else, and she had not weighed enough. She was not worth the disruption. She did not scream. She did not beg. She had too much of the old blood in her for either of those things. She held his gaze for a long time, long enough that the hall grew profoundly uncomfortable, long enough that she saw the first flicker of something other than certainty move behind his eyes. Too late for that. Whatever that was, it was too late. She turned around, and she walked out of the hall of Valdemar Keep, and she did not look back, and she walked until the stone gave way to earth, and the torchlight gave way to stars, and the stars gave way to the black canopy of the Greywood. And she walked into the dark, and the dark swallowed her whole. Behind her, she heard nothing, not one set of footsteps, not one voice calling her name. Nothing. Good, something inside her said, something cold and ancient that had been sleeping in her blood for a very long time and was now, for the first time, opening its eyes. Good. Let them keep their silence. We will not need them. She had not known then how right that voice was. She had not known yet what was already growing in the dark, inside her, quiet and devastating, and entirely without mercy. She did not know yet what her body was building. But the Greywood knew. The Greywood had always known. The Greywood should have killed her. Every story the wolf kingdoms told about that forest ended the same way. You went in and you did not come back. Or you came back wrong, eyes too wide and tongue too loose, and something missing from behind your face that had been there before. The Greywood was not safe. The Greywood was not a place you survived through skill or strength or careful preparation. The Greywood was a place you survived only if the Greywood decided to let you. It let Rhavyn. She understood in the first days that this was not luck. The forest recognized something in her. Not her grief. Grief was ordinary, and the Greywood had no particular interest in ordinary things. Not her strength, though she had that. Not even her rage, which was building now. Slow and cold and layered like ice, forming over the surface of deep water. It recognized her blood, the Greywood blood. The bloodline that had walked this forest for centuries before the wolf kingdoms had organized themselves into territories, keeps, and political alliances. The bloodline that the packs had quietly, carefully erased from every official record because the power it carried was not the kind of power that could be controlled by a treaty or contained by a title. Her grandmother had been the last to carry it fully. Her mother had carried a trace of it, enough to teach Rhavyn the old words and the old ways of listening. Rhavyn herself had never known what lived in her blood because it had never been needed before. It was needed now. It woke slowly, not with ceremony, not with drama. It woke the way a sleeping animal wakes, one sense at a time, testing the air before it opens its eyes. She learned to hear the forest, not words, something older than words, intention, direction, the specific quality of silence that meant safety and the different quality that meant turn around right now and the rarest kind. The deep, resonant hum that she slowly understood meant here. This is the place. Stop and be still. She found water this way, shelter, food she would never have found through ordinary knowledge. She found in the third week a hollow in the roots of a tree so vast she could not see its crown, and she understood without being told that this was where she would spend the winter. She survived the first month, and then the second, and somewhere in the third month, sitting by the small fire she had learned to build in a way that would not be seen from above, and she realized she had stopped thinking about going back, not because she had decided to stay forever, but because the question itself had become irrelevant. Going back to what? The hall where 400 wolves had watched and said nothing. The man who had calculated her worth and found the number insufficient. The court that had already, she had heard through the forest in ways she could not yet explain, accepted Mira of the Southern Reach as Luna of Valdenmoor, as though the bond had never happened, as though Rhavyn had been an inconvenience that had resolved itself by walking away. There was nothing to go back to. There was only forward. She did not know yet that forward was going to break everything they had ever built. It was the 5th month when her body told her, not with symptoms, or not only with symptoms, with something more fundamental than that. A knowing that arrived one morning while she was crouched by the stream filling her water skin, and the light was coming through the Greywood canopy in long, pale shafts, and the forest was very quiet around her. A knowing that moved through her like a slow wave from somewhere deep and said, "You are not alone." She sat back on her heels and pressed her hand flat against her stomach and stayed like that for a very long time. 5 months. She was 5 months into the Greywood, 5 months since the ceremony, and she had been so consumed by survival, by grief, by the slow waking of something ancient in her blood that she had not noticed the other thing waking. Zayden's child, his heir, growing in the dark and the quiet and the cold of a forest that the wolf kingdoms feared, and in the body of the woman he had dismissed, fed by the same ancient blood that the Greywood had spent 5 months teaching to remember itself. She stayed crouched by the stream for a very long time. She felt many things, not what she would have expected to feel, not devastation. She had already been devastated, had already walked through that fire and come out the other side into something colder and more useful than devastation. Not even grief, though it moved through her briefly, the shadow of grief for the life she had believed in, the ceremony and the bond and the foolish certainty that fate meant kindness. What she felt beneath all of it was something she could not immediately name. It took her until dark to name it. Recognition. She had been trying to understand why the Greywood had let her in. Why had her blood chosen this moment? Of all the moments in her life to wake fully. Why the forest had taken a broken woman and spent 5 months making her into something else. The forest had not been waking her. It had been waking them. Her and this child. This specific child growing in this specific blood, in this specific place, at this specific point in the long, slow history of the Greywood and the wolf kingdoms and the power that the packs had spent 3 centuries trying to forget. She pressed both hands against her stomach. She said out loud to the forest and the dark and the child she could not yet feel move, "I see you. I do not know yet what you are, but I am not afraid." The Greywood answered with the deep, resonant hum she had come to associate with, "Yes, this is the place. Stop and be still." She stopped. She was still. And she waited to meet her daughter. And then she was born in the depths of the second winter. Rhavyn had prepared for 6 weeks in the focused, methodical way the Greywood had taught her, which was different from the way she had prepared for anything before the forest. Before, preparation had meant gathering resources, building contingencies, and protecting against failure. The Greywood had taught her a different kind of preparation, the kind that was less about controlling outcomes and more about becoming capable of receiving them. She received her daughter on the coldest night of the year, alone in the hollow of the great root tree, with the Greywood holding the silence around her like cupped hands. The child did not cry. That was the first thing. Every child cries when coming into the world. It is the first proof of life, the declaration of arrival, the announcement that something that was not here is now here. Rhavyn's daughter opened her eyes. In the dark, in the cold, in the absolute silence of the Greywood at deepest winter, she opened her eyes and she looked at Rhavyn with eyes that were not the gray of Zayden Voss, though that gray was there underneath. They were lit. Not with reflection, there was no light source strong enough in that hollow for reflection. They were lit from within, with something amber and ancient and completely, terrifyingly aware. And the Greywood, which had been silent for the entirety of Rhavyn's labor, which had held its breath the way it held it for nothing ordinary, released a sound she had never heard from it before. Not the directional hum, not the warning silence, not any of the languages it had taught her over months of patient instruction. And this was something that moved through the roots of every tree in the forest simultaneously, something that was less a sound than a recognition, the way an entire body recognizes a name it was given before it was born. The forest knew her daughter, had been waiting for her daughter, had let Rhavyn in not for Rhavyn's sake alone, but for this specific child, for this specific arrival, for the thing this child carried in her blood that was the Greywood blood and the Valdenmoor blood and the bond that had been rejected, all wound together into something that had not existed in the wolf kingdoms in 300 years. Rhavyn held her daughter and felt the power moving in the infant's small body, already awake, already fully present in a way that her own power had taken months of grief and survival to reach. She named her Nira, and in the old language of the Greywood, the language Rhavyn's mother had taught her in fragments and whispers, Nira meant the reckoning that was always coming. She had not chosen the name. It had arrived in her mind the moment she saw those lit eyes, complete and certain, the way the Greywood told her things. She looked at her daughter and understood, with a clarity that moved through her like cold water, what she was holding. She was holding the end of Valdenmoor, not because she would make it so. She would have choices in the years ahead, and she would make them carefully, and some of them would be merciful. But Nira's choices would be her own. And Nira had been built by blood and forest and the catastrophic miscalculation of a man who had not understood what he was refusing for exactly one purpose, not vengeance. Rhavyn had carried vengeance in her for months, and she knew its weight and its limits. Something older than vengeance, correction. The Wolf Kingdoms had broken something 3 centuries ago when they had driven the Greywood bloodline out and burned the histories and told themselves the story of what they had done until they believed it was simply the way things had always been. And broken things, left long enough, either collapse or correct. Nira was the correction, and she had Zayden Voss's blood in her veins, which meant she had every right the law of the Wolf Kingdoms recognized to stand in the hall of Valdenmoor Keep and speak. He had rejected the mother. He could not reject the heir. Nira grew up in the forest, and the forest grew up around her. That was the only way Rhavyn could ever describe it afterward. The Greywood did not merely tolerate her daughter the way it had learned to tolerate Rhavyn. The Greywood organized itself around Nira. Trees that had stood for centuries shifted in ways that created paths and sheltered clearings where there had been none. The creatures of the deep forest, the ones that avoided even Rhavyn, came to Nira without fear and stayed without agenda, simply present, the way devoted things are present. She walked at 8 months. She should not have been able to walk at 8 months. She did it without falling, without the uncertain wobble of a child learning balance. She stood up one morning in the root hollow and walked to the entrance, and stopped at the threshold and looked out at the forest with those amber-lit eyes. And Rhavyn, watching from across the hollow, understood that her daughter was not learning to walk. She was returning to something she already knew. She spoke her first word at 10 months. Not mama. None of the soft sounds children reach for first. She looked up at the canopy, and she said in a voice that was far too clear and far too certain for a 10-month-old child, the oldest word in the Greywood language, the one that Rhavyn's mother had told her was too powerful to speak casually, the word that meant, I am here, and I remember, and I am ready. Rhavyn sat down on the ground and stared at her daughter for a very long time. She was raising something extraordinary. She'd known it since the night of the birth. But knowing it and watching it move through the forest at 10 months old, calling to the ancient wood in a language older than the Wolf Kingdoms, were 2 very different things. She felt in that moment 2 things simultaneously that should not have been able to exist together. Terror, and the most ferocious, consuming, absolute love she had ever known. She taught Nira everything she knew, the old language, the forest ways, the history that the packs had tried to erase, the full truth of what the Greywood bloodline was and what it meant, and why the Wolf Kingdoms had spent 3 centuries being afraid of it. She taught it without softening it, without the careful smallness her own mother had layered over the teaching. Nira did not need protecting from the truth of what she was. She needed to know it completely so she could decide what to do with it. By the time Nira was 4 years old, she was dreaming in the old language, and the dreams were not dreams. They were memories. Not her own memories, but the Greywood's, centuries of accumulated witnessing, flowing through the child's sleeping mind with a completeness and a specificity that sometimes made her cry when she woke. not from sadness, but from the sheer volume of what she was being given. By the time she was 5, the forest had shown her Valdemar, not in person, in the way the Greywood showed things, through root and resonance and the deep old network that moved beneath the soil of every territory in the northern lands. She had seen the keep. She had seen the hall. She had seen the man with the winter-gray eyes that were the same as hers. And she had looked at him for a long time with an expression that Rhavyn, watching her daughter's face, could not fully read. Then Nira had looked at Rhavyn and said, "In the old language, he does not know what he broke." Rhavyn had said, "No, he does not." Nira had said, "I will show him," not with anger, not with the heat of a child's righteous fury, with the same flat certainty that the forest used when it told Rhavyn which path was safe and which was not, a statement of fact about something that had not happened yet. Rhavyn had looked at her daughter in the firelight of the root hollow and felt the full weight of what she had brought into the world settle over her, like a cloak. Not regret, never regret. Only the deep, sober understanding that what she had carried out of Valdemar that night, without knowing it, without intending it, without being given any choice in the matter at all, was not simply a child born of a broken bond, or it was the answer to a question the wolf kingdoms had been avoiding for 300 years. And the answer had her mother's blood and her father's eyes, and it had just turned 5 years old, and it was already dreaming in a language that predated every throne in the northern territories. Zayden Voss did not know. He was going to find out. While Rhavyn disappeared into the Greywood and became something the wolf kingdoms had no current word for, Valdemar continued. The court adjusted. Courts always adjust. The incident at the blood moon ceremony was discussed in careful, minimal terms and then filed into the category of unfortunate necessities, and the business of ruling went on. Mira of the Southern Reach became Luna of Valdemar 6 months after the ceremony. She was everything the court needed her to be: connected, political, strategic. She understood the mechanisms of power, and she operated them with the calm efficiency of someone who had been raised for exactly this role. She was also, beneath the efficiency and the strategy and the careful political surface, deeply afraid. She had felt it at the ceremony, standing 3 feet from Zayden when he made his declaration. She had felt the bond that existed between him and the woman in the bone-white gown, had felt it the way you feel heat from a fire you are standing too close to, and she had understood in that moment that what Zayden was rejecting was not ordinary. She had watched Rhavyn walk out, and she had thought, "Good, she is gone. It is over." But it was not over. She felt it in Zayden first. The bond did not break when he rejected it. She had known it might not, had known the risks, or had factored them into the decision she had been part of making. But knowing the theory and living inside the reality were different things entirely. He was present in all the ways that mattered, attentive and functional and correct in every visible way. But there was something in him that was permanently elsewhere, an absence she could feel but never locate, a door inside him that stayed closed no matter how close she stood. He had rejected the bond. The bond had not released him. She did not speak of this. There was nothing useful to say, and then the other things started. Small things at first, border reports from the Greywood edge, scouts who went into the outer forest and came back, not harmed but changed in some quiet way they could not articulate, animals behaving outside their patterns, the oldest pack members, with the ones who carried the deep memory of the northern territories in their bones, were growing restless and watchful without being able to say why. And the dreams. They spread through the pack the way weather spreads, starting at the borders and moving inward. Dreams of the Greywood, dreams of amber light in deep darkness, dreams of a voice speaking in a language that the dreamer did not know but understood completely, the way you understand things in dreams that you cannot translate into waking. Mira did not dream these dreams, but she heard about them, and she went to the oldest archivist in the Valden Moor Library, and she asked him very quietly what the old record said about the Greywood bloodline. He was silent for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "The records say the bloodline cannot be rejected, only deferred. Thus in the deferral has a cost that compounds with time." She asked what the cost was. He said, "The histories are not specific. Only that 3 centuries ago a Valden Moor Alpha rejected a Greywood woman at a blood moon ceremony, and 7 years later, the pack, as it had existed until that point, simply ceased to be. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply replaced, completely and permanently, by something that had been building in the Greywood for 7 years. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to Zayden and she told him everything the archivist had said. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was silent for so long that the fire in the grate had burned down to coals before he spoke. He said very quietly, in the voice of a man asking a question he had not been asking for 6 years, because the answer was the one thing he could not afford. How old would the child be now? She had not known there was a child. The silence that followed that sentence was the most honest thing that had ever existed between them. It lasted a long time. And in that silence, in the cold grate, in the dark of the Valden Moor keep that had stood for 3 centuries and was now, for the first time, uncertain of its own ground, something shifted. The same something that was shifting at that exact moment in every border post and outer wall and deep foundation stone of the kingdom. The Greywood was not dreaming anymore. The Greywood was moving. She did not march on Valden Moor. She did not send a declaration, a threat, or any of the visible signals of approaching conflict that a court could prepare a response to. She walked to the edge of the Greywood. She and Nira, who was 6 years old and moved through the forest the way water moves, without effort and without obstacle, arrived at the tree line in the gray light of early morning. Rhavyn had not seen Valden Moor in 6 years. She stood at the boundary between the forest and the territory and felt the mate bond, still there, still fractured but not severed, pull toward the keep the way a compass needle pulls north. She felt nothing warm about it, only the fact of it, the way you feel an old scar, present and familiar, and no longer the thing that defines you. She looked down at Nira. Nira was looking at Valden Moor with those amber-lit eyes, taking in the outer walls and the towers and the whole architecture of the kingdom her father had chosen over her mother's life, and her face was completely, yet impossibly still. She said, "It is smaller than the forest showed me." Rhavyn said, "Most things are smaller when you stand in front of them." Nira considered this. Then she said, "Are we going in?" Rhavyn said, "Not yet, not today. Today we let them see us, because that was how the Greywood moved. Not in force, in presence, in the specific quality of being seen that changes the one who sees, in the particular kind of stillness that walks into a room and does not announce itself and does not have to, because the room already knows something has changed. They stood at the tree line for 1 hour. Every border post on the Valden Moor outer wall could see them. Rhavyn stood with the Greywood power moving visibly in her, no longer hidden, no longer apologetic, present the way a river is present. Not because it announces itself, but because it is simply and completely there. And Nira, beside her, 6 years old, small and perfectly still, with her father's gray eyes lit amber from within, looking at the walls of Valden Moor with the patient and absolute attention of something that has all the time in the world. Then they turned around and walked back into the forest. They did not come back the next day, or the day after, but the pack had seen them, and the dreams that had been moving through Valden Moor for months grew vivid and urgent and specific in a way they had not been before. And Zayden stood at the highest window of the keep and looked at the tree line where they had stood until the light failed completely. And when Mira said his name twice before he heard her, and he turned from the window with the face of a man who had spent 6 years in one kind of understanding and had just, in the space of 1 hour at dawn, arrived at a completely different one, he said, "She brought the child." Mira said nothing. He said, "I felt her at the tree line, through the bond." He said, "I felt them both." She came to Valdenmoor on the night of the next blood moon, 6 years to the day after the ceremony. She did not come with an army. She did not need one. The Greywood came with her in the way that the sea comes with a wave, not separately but as its source and its substance, and the wolves who stood at the outer gates of Valdenmoor Keep felt it before they saw her, and stepped aside before they were asked to, moved by something older than the orders they had been given. And she walked through the outer court and the inner court and into the great hall of Valdenmoor Keep, and it was full, because the blood moon ceremony always filled the hall, and every wolf in it turned to look at her, and the turning was not curiosity. It was recognition, not of her face, of what she carried, of what walked beside her in the form of a 6-year-old child with amber-lit eyes, who looked at 400 wolves without fear and without aggression and without anything that a court protocol could address, because there was no protocol for this. For a child who looked at you like that, with that quality of knowing, like she had been watching you from somewhere close for a very long time. Rhavyn walked the length of the hall. She stopped 10 feet from Zayden. She looked at him, and for the first time in 6 years, on the full bond move between them, not the fractured, aching remnant she had been carrying, but the full thing, woken by proximity and blood moon and the presence of the child they had made together. And it hit them both like a wave, hit something that has been standing in its path for a long time. She did not reach for it. She let it move through her, and she stood in it, and she felt everything it wanted to give her, and she let it pass, the way you let a wave pass when you are rooted deep enough in the sand, and when it had passed, she was still standing exactly where she had been, still, certain, completely herself. Zayden's face was the face of a man who had just understood something that he would spend the rest of his life not being able to unknow. Nira looked at him. 6 years old, small enough that the hall should have dwarfed her. The hall did not dwarf her. The hall organized itself around her the way the Greywood had, the way things organize around objects of sufficient gravity, not with drama, but with inevitability. She spoke, not in the old language, in the common tongue, in a 6-year-old voice that filled the hall without effort and without performance. She said, "I am Nira of the Greywood. I am of your blood and of the blood you rejected. The forest has been watching Valdenmoor for 6 years. I have been watching Valdenmoor for 6 years. I know what you built and what you broke, and what the breaking cost and what it is still costing and what it will cost before the account is settled." She said, "I have not come for your title. I have not come to your land. I have not come for your throne or your court or any of the things you have built your life on top of. She said, I have come to tell you that the account is open. The Greywood does not close accounts with rejections. It closes them with truth. You rejected the bond and you told yourself the story of why, and you believed the story, and you built a life inside it. I am the part of the story you left out." She said, "I will be back when I am grown, not to take, to correct. And when I come back, you will not be able to stop the correction, because the correction is not coming from me alone. It is coming from everything that has been building in the Greywood for 3 centuries, waiting for the right vessel, and it has found one, and she is standing in your hall right now, and she is 6 years old, and she is already more patient than you will ever be." She pressed one small hand flat against the stone floor of the great hall. The Greywood answered, not from the Greywood, from beneath, from the roots that ran under the soil of all the northern territories, under the roads and the walls and the foundations of every keep that had ever been built on land the forest had been pushed back from, the roots that had been there before any of it and would be thereafter. The answer moved through the stones of the hall like a tide moving through the rock beneath a shoreline, slow and absolute and entirely without hurry. Every wolf in the hall felt it, in the soles of their feet, in the base of their spines, in the particular animal place behind the ribs where certainty lives and cannot be argued with. They felt the Greywood beneath them, under everything they had built, patient and present and completely, permanently awake, not threatening, not yet, simply there, reminding them that the ground they were standing on had a memory that predated every decision any of them had ever made. Zayden Voss stood in his hall and felt his daughter's power move through the stones he had walked every day of his reign, and he understood, in the way that people understand things that arrive too late and too completely to be absorbed all at once, what he had done. Not in the moment of the ceremony. He had understood that, at some level, for years. What he had not understood until this moment, with his daughter's hand flat on his floor and the Greywood breathing through his foundations, was the full scale of what he had refused. Not a woman, not even a bloodline. A correction that the wolf kingdoms had been building toward for 300 years, patient and inevitable and completely without malice. The way a river is without malice when it finally finds the crack in the dam that has been holding it back. He had not built the dam. He had been the crack. She did not wait for him to speak. She had not crossed 6 years of exile and grief and becoming for his words. She had not walked back into that hall for his guilt or his understanding or the particular look on his face, which was the look of a man who had finally counted the full cost of a decision he could not unmake. She had come for one thing only, to be seen, by him, by the court, by every wolf who had stood in this hall 6 years ago and chosen silence. She wanted them to see her, not the girl in white who had walked out broken, what she was now, what the forest had made of her grief, what the darkest years of her life had built in her blood and her bones, and the quiet, a devastating core of her that had refused, through everything, to stop existing. She wanted them to see Naira, and they had. She looked at Zayden one last time across 10 feet of cold stone. She let herself feel the bond, the full weight of it, the fracture running through it like a crack in old ice, still holding, still pulling, still carrying the particular ache of something that was made to be whole and was never allowed to be. It hurt. 6 years later, standing in the hall where it had happened, it still hurt. She had thought she was past the hurt. She was not past the hurt. She understood now that she would never be past the hurt, that the hurt was not a weakness or a failure of her healing, but simply the truth of what bonds are, the truth that the wolf kingdoms did not put in their histories because it was inconvenient, which is that you do not stop feeling a fated bond simply because someone chose to break it. You carry it. You carry it the way you carry everything that shaped you, and you decide every single day whether it is something that diminishes you or something that is simply part of the weight that made you strong enough to stand here. She had decided, a long time ago. In the dark of the Greywood, with cold ground beneath her and a daughter asleep against her chest, and the forest breathing around them both like something that would never, under any circumstances, let them fall. She looked at him. She let him see the decision on her face. And then she turned around, and she walked, back down the length of the great hall, through the gates, into the night, into the forest, into everything that was hers. Behind her, in the silence in the hall of Valdenmoor, was total. 400 wolves, not one voice. But this time the silence was different. This time, it was not the silence of people choosing not to see. This time, it was the silence of a kingdom that had just felt, through the stones beneath its feet, through the roots beneath the stones, through the deep old network of a forest that had been patient for 6 years and was patient still, the first tremor of what was coming. Not today, not yet, but coming. As certain as the moon, as patient as the Greywood, as inevitable as a daughter who carries the reckoning in her blood and has not yet decided when to open her hands. That is the world of claimed by blood. No soft endings. No forgiveness is handed out like it costs nothing. No woman made small so a man can feel large. Only truth. Only the full weight of what it costs to survive something that was designed to destroy you. Only the dark, patient, devastating power of a woman who went into the forest broken and came back as something the wolf kingdoms had no word for. This is what we do here. Every single day. A new story. A new woman. A new darkness that does not apologize for itself. If this is your world too, you know what to do. Subscribe to Claimed by Blood. Turn on every notification. Tell one person who needs this story that it exists, and come back tomorrow, because the next woman is already in the forest, and she is already becoming something they are not ready for. Claimed by Blood. New stories every single day. Dark fantasy werewolf romance. No redemption. No apology. No mercy for those who earned none.